David Rodriguez thought he had found paradise when he bought his house in Willowbrook Gardens. After 3 brutal tours in Afghanistan as a Navy SEAL, all he wanted was peace and quiet. The neighborhood looked perfect: clean streets, well-kept lawns, and the kind of silence that only comes when you're far away from gunfire and explosions. The realtor had mentioned something about a homeowners association, but David barely paid attention. He'd dealt with military bureaucracy for years. How bad could a bunch of neighbors be? He found out pretty quickly. David's first hint of trouble came on his 3rd day in the house. He'd hung a small American flag by his front door. Nothing fancy, just a simple flag holder he'd picked up at the hardware store. The next morning, there was a letter in his mailbox. Official letterhead, serious language, and a tone that made his jaw tighten. Notice of violation, it read. Unauthorized exterior decoration. Please remove immediately or face fines. David stared at the letter for a long time. He'd fought for that flag, bled for it, lost friends defending what it stood for, and now some neighborhood committee was telling him he couldn't display it at his own home? He crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. The next violation notice came a week later. This time it was about his truck. David drove a beat-up Ford pickup that had seen better days, but it ran fine and got him where he needed to go. According to the HOA, parking it in his driveway instead of the garage was detrimental to property values. David laughed out loud when he read that one. In Afghanistan, he'd slept in vehicles that looked like they'd been through a blender. His truck was practically a luxury car by comparison. But the letters kept coming. Grass too long by half an inch. Garbage can visible 30 minutes past pickup time. Garden hose left coiled by the side of the house. Each violation came with mounting fines and increasingly threatening language. David started paying attention to who was behind all this. The HOA president was a woman named Patricia Blackwell, a retired corporate executive who ran the association like her personal kingdom. She lived in the biggest house in the neighborhood and drove a car that cost more than most people made in a year. Patricia had a vision for Willowbrook Gardens, and that vision apparently didn't include trucks, flags, or anything that reminded her that regular working people lived there too. David wasn't the only target. As he walked around the neighborhood, he started noticing other houses with violation notices taped to their doors. There was the elderly man at the end of the street who'd served in Korea. His crime was using a walker on his front porch. The young woman 2 blocks over had lost her husband in Iraq and kept a small memorial garden in her yard. According to the HOA, her flowers were the wrong color. It became clear that Patricia and her crew had a type. Veterans, blue-collar workers, anyone who didn't fit their picture-perfect suburban dream, they all got the same treatment. David tried the reasonable approach first. He called the HOA office and asked to speak with Patricia. The secretary told him she was in meetings. He tried again the next day. Still in meetings. After a week of calls, he finally got through. Patricia's voice was ice cold. Mr. Rodriguez, I assume you're calling about your violations. The rules are clearly stated in your homeowner agreement. I suggest you read them. I did read them, David said, keeping his voice calm. But some of these interpretations seem pretty extreme. The flag, for instance. The flag is a distraction, Patricia cut him off. This is a quality community. We maintain standards. It's an American flag. It's an unauthorized exterior modification. David felt that familiar surge of anger he'd learned to control in the military. I served under that flag. I think I've earned the right to display it. There was a pause. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had an edge that made David's skin crawl. Mr. Rodriguez, your background doesn't give you special privileges here. Everyone follows the same rules. The way she said background made it clear what she really thought about veterans. David asked about attending the next HOA meeting to discuss the issues face-to-face. Patricia informed him that meetings were held on Wednesday afternoons at 2 o'clock. David pointed out that most working people couldn't attend at that time. People who care about their community make time, Patricia said, and hung up. David drove by the community center that Wednesday at 2. There were exactly 5 cars in the parking lot, all expensive luxury vehicles. Through the window, he could see Patricia and her inner circle sitting around a conference table, making decisions for hundreds of families. That's when David realized this wasn't about rules or property values. This was about power and control. Patricia and her friends had found a way to run other people's lives, and they were enjoying every minute of it. The harassment continued for months. Every few days brought a new violation notice, a new fine, a new threat. David's mail slot became a constant source of stress. The fines added up, $50 here, $100 there. Late fees and penalty charges stacking on top of each other. David had saved up enough money from his military service to handle the financial hit. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he'd come home from fighting for freedom overseas, only to find his own freedom under attack by people who'd never risked anything more dangerous than a bad stock investment. The breaking point came on a quiet Tuesday morning in spring. David was working in his garage when he heard shouting from across the street. He looked up to see Patricia herself standing in his neighbor's yard, pointing at a small American flag decal on the man's mailbox and yelling at him to remove it. The neighbor was Bill Thompson, a Vietnam veteran who walked with a cane and had never bothered anyone. Bill was trying to explain that it was just a sticker, but Patricia wasn't listening. She was treating this old soldier like a criminal over a 2-inch flag decal. That's when David knew this had gone too far. Patricia and her crew weren't just power-hungry bullies anymore. They were actively targeting veterans, trying to erase any reminder that people had fought and died for the freedoms they took for granted. David had been trained to handle much worse than a suburban dictator. But he'd also been trained to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And right now his neighbors needed protection from their own HOA. As he watched Patricia storm off, leaving Bill Thompson standing alone and confused in his own yard, David made a decision. He'd tried playing by their rules. He'd tried being reasonable. Now it was time to call in reinforcements. The harassment got worse after David's phone call with Patricia. It was like she'd taken his challenge personally and decided to make him an example for the rest of the neighborhood. The violation notices started coming daily. David's grass was measured with a ruler. If it was even a 1/4 inch over the 3-inch limit, he got a fine. His garbage can had to be completely invisible from the street by 8 a.m. sharp on collection day, or another $50 penalty appeared in his mailbox. They even cited him for having excessive moisture on his driveway after he washed his truck. But Patricia wasn't satisfied with just paperwork warfare. She'd found allies in the local code enforcement office, and suddenly David was dealing with surprise inspections from the city. These weren't regular safety checks. They were fishing expeditions, looking for anything they could use against him. The first inspector showed up on a Saturday morning while David was having coffee. The man introduced himself as Frank Morrison from Code Enforcement and said he'd received complaints about possible structural modifications to David's house. What kind of modifications? David asked, genuinely confused. Frank looked uncomfortable. Well, the report says you might be running some kind of business out of your garage. Maybe storing hazardous materials. David almost laughed. His garage contained exactly what you'd expect. Some tools, his workout equipment, and boxes of old military gear he couldn't bring himself to throw away. "You're welcome to take a look," he said. Frank poked around for 20 minutes, clearly finding nothing wrong. As he was leaving, he apologized. "Look, between you and me, these complaints seem pretty bogus. But when we get a call, we have to follow up." "Who called it in?" David asked. Frank hesitated. "Can't say officially, but let's just say it came from someone with a lot of influence in the neighborhood association." After Frank left, David realized what was happening. Patricia was using the city as her personal enforcement arm. She couldn't legally enter his property herself, so she was getting the government to do it for her. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Every time David fixed one violation, 2 more appeared. When he moved his truck to the garage, they cited him for having an unauthorized oil stain on the driveway where it used to park. When he pressure washed the stain away, they complained about water runoff onto the sidewalk. It was psychological warfare, plain and simple. David recognized the tactics from his military training. Constant pressure, moving goalposts, making the target feel like resistance was hopeless. In a combat zone, this kind of harassment was designed to break down enemy morale before the real attack. The difference was that Patricia was using these tactics on American citizens in their own neighborhood. David wasn't the only one suffering. The targeting of veterans had become systematic and deliberate. Bill Thompson, the Vietnam vet across the street, was now getting daily citations for his walker being visible on his front porch. The HOA claimed it was medical equipment that detracted from the neighborhood's appearance. 3 blocks away, Helen Martinez was facing foreclosure proceedings. Her husband had died in Iraq 2 years earlier, and she'd created a small memorial garden in her front yard. Nothing elaborate, just some roses and a small wooden cross with his name. Patricia's crew had declared it a religious display that violated the community's secular appearance standards. The young Marine's widow was drowning in legal fees, trying to fight fines that had snowballed into tens of thousands of dollars. David drove by her house one evening and saw her sitting on her front steps crying, while her 8-year-old daughter tried to comfort her. That image burned itself into David's memory. This wasn't about property values or community standards anymore. This was about powerful people destroying the lives of families who'd already sacrificed everything for their country. David tried to organize resistance among the other targeted residents. He suggested they all attend the next HOA meeting together, present a united front, and demand fair treatment. But people were scared. Patricia had made it clear that fighting back only made things worse. "She's got connections everywhere," Bill Thompson told him. "The mayor, the city council, even some judges. I can't afford to fight this. I'm on a fixed income." Helen Martinez was even more direct. "They want me gone, and they're going to keep pushing until I can't take it anymore. I'm thinking about just selling and moving somewhere else." That's exactly what Patricia wanted, David realized. She wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to force out anyone who didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should be. And she was succeeding. David's turning point came during his 3rd code enforcement inspection in 2 months. This time, the inspector was a different guy. Younger, more aggressive, and clearly enjoying his authority. His name was Derek Volkov, and he'd been specially assigned to handle Willowbrook Gardens cases. Derek showed up with a clipboard full of complaints and an attitude that immediately put David on edge. Unlike Frank Morrison, who'd been apologetic about the bogus calls, Derek acted like David was automatically guilty of something. "I'm here about reports of unauthorized business activities," Derek announced without any greeting. "I need to inspect your garage, your basement, and any outbuildings." "What kind of business activities?" David asked. "That's what I'm here to find out." Derek spent an hour going through David's belongings with obvious hostility. He photographed David's military awards hanging on the garage wall, asking pointed questions about whether David was selling military memorabilia without proper licensing. He measured the shelving David had installed, claiming it might constitute an unpermitted structural modification. The whole thing felt like harassment disguised as official business. Derek was clearly fishing for violations, and when he couldn't find any real problems, he started making them up. "This electrical outlet looks like it might not be up to current code," Derek said, pointing to a perfectly normal wall plug. "It was installed when the house was built," David replied. "Building codes change. You might need to have it updated." Derek left with a list of potential violations that would require follow-up inspections and possible fines. As David watched him drive away, he noticed Derek's car heading straight toward Patricia Blackwell's house. That evening, David called his old team leader from the SEALs. Jake Morrison had gotten out of the military 2 years before David and was now running a successful security consulting business in Los Angeles. "Jake, I need some advice," David said, and told him the whole story. Jake listened without interrupting, asking only a few clarifying questions. When David finished, there was a long pause. "Dave, what you're describing isn't just HOA overreach," Jake finally said. "This sounds like organized harassment, possibly civil rights violations. They're targeting veterans specifically, using government resources to do it and involving financial coercion. That's federal territory." "I just want them to leave me alone," David said. "I get that. But here's the thing. If you don't fight this, it's going to keep happening to other people. Other veterans, other families who can't defend themselves. You know what we used to say about bullies." David did know. In the SEALs, they'd been taught that bullies only understand one language: strength. Not violence, but strength. The kind that comes from refusing to back down when you're in the right. "What do you think I should do?" David asked. "Document everything. Keep records of every violation, every inspection, every interaction with these people. And if it gets worse," Jake paused. "Well, you know you're not alone in this. The team doesn't abandon its own." After hanging up, David sat in his garage looking at his military commendations and thinking about what Jake had said. He'd spent years fighting enemies overseas, protecting the freedoms that Patricia and her crew were now trying to take away from him at home. Maybe it was time to remind them what those freedoms had cost, and what happened when good people decided they weren't going to take it anymore. The war for Willowbrook Gardens was just getting started. David woke up to the sound of his front door exploding. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and he'd been deep in the kind of dreamless sleep that only comes after years of training your mind to rest despite constant danger. The thunderous crash of splintering wood instantly triggered every combat instinct he'd developed over 3 tours in Afghanistan. Before his conscious mind could fully process what was happening, David was rolling out of bed and reaching for the baseball bat he kept by his nightstand. His heart was pounding with the familiar rhythm of adrenaline that had kept him alive in countless firefights. Police. Don't move! David froze. Through his bedroom doorway, he could see flashlight beams cutting through the dawn darkness of his living room. Multiple voices were shouting commands. Boots were stomping across his hardwood floors, and someone was yelling about violations and emergency inspections. This wasn't a police raid. David had been through enough real operations to know the difference. This was something else entirely. He pulled on pants and a t-shirt, keeping his hands visible as he walked slowly toward his destroyed front door. What he saw in his living room made his blood run cold. 3 men in quasi-military gear were rifling through his belongings while 2 actual sheriff's deputies stood near the entrance looking deeply uncomfortable. The leader of the group was Derek Volkov, the aggressive code enforcement officer who'd been harassing him for weeks. But Derek wasn't wearing his usual city uniform. Instead, he was dressed in black tactical gear, complete with a badge that read HOA Enforcement Division. What the hell is going on here? David demanded, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Derek spun around with the kind of aggressive posturing that David recognized from wannabe tough guys who'd never seen real combat. Mr. Rodriguez, we're executing an emergency inspection of these premises based on reports of immediate threats to community safety. You broke down my door. We attempted to make contact, Derek said, clearly enjoying himself. When you failed to respond promptly to our lawful demands for entry, we were forced to ensure community safety by gaining immediate access. David looked at the 2 sheriff's deputies, hoping for some sanity. The older one, a sergeant named Bill Murphy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stepped forward. Sir, we received a call about possible illegal weapons storage and hazardous materials, Murphy said apologetically. The HOA has special authority in this community to request immediate inspections for safety violations. Weapons storage? David couldn't believe what he was hearing. I'm a retired Navy SEAL. I own exactly 2 firearms, both legally registered and properly stored. Derek pulled out an official-looking document. According to our information, you've been observed bringing military equipment into this residence and may be operating an illegal arms dealing business. That's insane. We'll be the judge of that. For the next hour, David watched helplessly as Derek and his crew systematically violated his privacy and dignity. They photographed his military commendations with sneering comments about playing soldier. They opened every closet, every drawer, every personal container in his house. When they found his properly locked gun safe, Derek demanded he open it. David complied, revealing his service pistol and a hunting rifle, both completely legal and exactly what he'd told them he owned. Interesting, Derek said, taking pictures. These could be considered assault weapons under certain interpretations. They're standard firearms that I'm legally entitled to own, David replied through gritted teeth. We'll let the courts decide that. But the worst moment came when they reached David's spare bedroom, which he'd converted into a small home gym and storage area for his military memorabilia. Derek immediately zeroed in on a footlocker containing David's old combat gear, uniforms, medals, photos of his unit, and personal items from his deployments. Derek opened the footlocker and started pulling out David's most treasured possessions, handling them like they were evidence of some crime. He held up a photo of David's SEAL team and made a disgusted face. Look at this, Derek called to his associates. Bunch of jarheads playing dress-up. David's vision went red. In Afghanistan, those jarheads had been his brothers. 3 of the men in that photo had died protecting Afghan civilians from Taliban attacks. 2 others had been wounded so badly they'd never walk normally again. And this wannabe security guard was mocking their sacrifice in David's own home. Put that down, David said quietly. Derek looked up with a smirk. Excuse me? I said put it down now. Something in David's voice made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. The two sheriff's deputies instinctively moved closer, sensing the sudden shift in tension. Derek, either too stupid or too arrogant to recognize danger when he saw it, doubled down. "You don't give orders here, soldier boy," Derek said, deliberately waving the photo. "This is my operation." David took a step forward, and Sergeant Murphy quickly positioned himself between the two men. "Easy, everyone," Murphy said. "Let's keep this professional." Derek finally put the photo down, but not before making one more comment. "Must be hard coming back from playing war games to the real world where actions have consequences." David had been shot at by Taliban fighters, had explosives go off close enough to rattle his teeth, had watched friends die in his arms, but nothing in 3 combat tours had made him angrier than watching this pathetic bully desecrate the memory of fallen heroes. The inspection finally ended with Derek's crew having found absolutely nothing illegal or dangerous. David's home was neat, his possessions were legal, and their entire search had been based on fabricated allegations. But Derek wasn't finished humiliating him. "We'll be filing a report recommending further investigation," Derek announced as they prepared to leave. "This community doesn't tolerate potential security threats." Security threats? David couldn't help himself. "I spent 6 years defending this country while you were probably getting kicked out of mall security." Derek's face flushed red. "Watch your mouth or you'll find out what real consequences look like." "Is that a threat?" Sergeant Murphy stepped in again. "All right, that's enough. We're done here." As the group finally left, Murphy lingered behind for a moment. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that call seemed bogus from the start. But when the HOA has special enforcement authority and claims there's an immediate safety threat, we have to respond." "Special enforcement authority? They've got some kind of arrangement with the city. I don't like it, but it's above my pay grade." After they left, David stood in his destroyed living room surveying the damage. His front door hung off its hinges, splintered wood scattered across the floor. His belongings had been rifled through and photographed. His most personal possessions had been handled and mocked by people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real crisis. But the physical damage wasn't what bothered him most. It was the realization that Patricia and her crew had escalated from harassment to what felt like home invasion. They'd used government authority to violate his constitutional rights, and they'd done it with the kind of sadistic pleasure that came from knowing their victims had no recourse. David walked over to his landline phone and dialed Jake Morrison's number. It rang twice before Jake picked up. "Dave, it's pretty early, man. Everything okay?" "Jake, they crossed the line. They broke down my door." David told him everything that had happened, from the forced entry to Derek's comments about his fallen teammates. Jake listened in silence, and David could practically hear his old team leader's anger building through the phone. "Dave, what you're describing isn't just harassment anymore. That was an illegal search based on false allegations. They violated your Fourth Amendment rights, and they targeted you specifically because of your military service. That's a federal civil rights violation." "I know what it was," David said. "The question is, what do we do about it?" There was a long pause before Jake answered. "Remember what we used to say in the teams? No one fights alone." "And Dave?" "Yeah? I think it's time to remind these people what happens when they mess with the wrong veteran. I'm making some calls." After hanging up, David walked back to his spare room and carefully repacked his military memorabilia. As he picked up the photo that Derek had mocked, he looked at the faces of his fallen brothers and made them a promise. These neighborhood bullies thought they were fighting against one isolated veteran who couldn't fight back. They were about to learn that Navy SEALs never operate alone, and they never abandon their own. The war for Willowbrook Gardens was about to get very interesting. Jake Morrison arrived first, pulling into David's driveway at 800 hours sharp in a rented black SUV. He was exactly the same as David remembered. Average height, unremarkable appearance, the kind of man who could blend into any crowd. Unless you looked closely at his eyes, you'd never guess he'd spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL team leader. "Brother," Jake said simply, giving David the kind of handshake that spoke volumes. Within 6 hours, 3 more vehicles had arrived. Ray Chen drove down from San Francisco, where he worked as a cybersecurity consultant for major tech companies. His specialty in the SEALs had been intelligence gathering, and David knew that if there were digital secrets to uncover, Ray would find them. Tom Bradley flew in from Denver. He'd been the team's unofficial lawyer even during their military days, always the one who understood regulations and procedures better than anyone else. After leaving the service, he'd finished law school and now worked for a firm specializing in civil rights cases. The last to arrive was Mike Santos, driving up from San Diego where he ran a private investigation business. Mike had been their reconnaissance specialist, the guy who could surveil a target for weeks without being detected. They gathered in David's living room, sitting around his coffee table like they were planning a mission briefing in Afghanistan, which, in a way, they were. First things first, Jake said, looking at the damage to David's front door. This isn't just about harassment anymore. What happened here was a home invasion disguised as official business. Tom nodded, pulling out a legal pad. Dave, I need you to walk me through everything from the beginning. Every violation notice, every phone call, every interaction with HOA officials and city inspectors. We're going to document this whole pattern of abuse. For the next 2 hours, David recounted months of systematic harassment. Tom took detailed notes while Ray set up his laptop and started researching the HOA's digital footprint. Mike studied maps of the neighborhood and took photos of David's damaged door. This is textbook civil rights violation, Tom said when David finished. Targeting veterans, using government resources for personal vendettas, conducting illegal searches. We've got multiple federal charges here. Ray looked up from his computer. And that's just the beginning. I've been digging into the HOA's financial records, the stuff that's publicly available. There are some interesting discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Jake asked. Well, for starters, they've collected over $2 million in fines and fees over the past 3 years, but their actual community maintenance expenses only account for about 30% of that money. Mike whistled low. Where's the rest going? That's what we need to find out, Ray said. But I'm betting Patricia and her crew have been treating the HOA like their personal piggy bank. Jake stood up and started pacing, falling back into his old role as mission commander. All right, here's how we're going to handle this. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice. We're going to take these people down using the same system they've been abusing. What's the plan? David asked. Ray, I want you to do a deep dive into their finances and digital communications. Stay completely legal. We're not breaking any laws here. Mike, start surveillance on Patricia and her inner circle. Document their activities, their meetings, who they talk to. Tom, research the legal framework. I want to understand exactly how they're claiming authority for these inspections. What about me? David asked. Jake smiled. You're going to do what you've been doing. Be the perfect neighbor. Keep documenting every violation notice, every harassment incident. But now you're not alone. Over the next week, the team worked with military precision. Ray discovered that the HOA had established a special enforcement division with the help of corrupt city officials. Patricia had been making campaign contributions to certain city council members and the mayor, and in return, they'd given her organization quasi-police powers that were probably illegal under state law. Mike's surveillance revealed that Patricia and Derek Volkoff were meeting regularly at expensive restaurants, often joined by Frank Morrison from code enforcement and other city officials. They weren't just abusing their authority, they were coordinating their abuse through what amounted to a criminal conspiracy. Tom found the smoking gun in the legal research. The special enforcement powers that the HOA claimed were based on an obscure city ordinance that had been passed without proper public notice and violated several state and federal laws regarding due process and civil rights. But Ray's financial investigation provided the most damaging evidence. Patricia hadn't just been skimming money from fines. She'd been systematically embezzling HOA funds for personal use. Designer clothes, luxury vacations, expensive jewelry, even payments on her car, all of it funded by money that was supposed to go toward community maintenance. She's stolen over $400,000 in the past 2 years alone, Ray reported during their evening briefing, and she's been falsifying records to cover it up. That's federal fraud, Tom said. Mail fraud, wire fraud, possibly racketeering if we can prove the conspiracy angle. Jake nodded. Time to bring in the professionals. The next morning, Tom made a series of phone calls to his contacts in federal law enforcement. By afternoon, they had meetings scheduled with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and the federal prosecutor's office. But Jake had one more surprise in store. Dave, I want you to meet someone, he said, as another SUV pulled into the driveway. The woman who got out was tall, professional-looking, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from serious authority. She introduced herself as Special Agent Lisa Park from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. "Mr. Rodriguez, your friends have brought me some very interesting information," Agent Park said. "What happened to you appears to be part of a larger pattern of civil rights violations, targeting veterans and minorities in this community." "How long has this been going on?" David asked. "Based on the evidence your team has gathered, at least 3 years, possibly longer. We've been getting complaints about HOA abuse of power across the state, but this is the most documented case we've seen." Agent Park explained that the FBI had been building a task force to investigate HOA corruption and civil rights violations. David's case wasn't isolated. Similar abuses were happening in communities across the country, where HOA boards had accumulated power without oversight. "The problem is that most victims don't have the resources to fight back," Agent Park said. "They either pay the fines or move away. But you gentlemen have done something remarkable here. You've built a federal case." Over the next 2 days, the team worked with FBI agents to organize all their evidence, Ray's financial records, Mike's surveillance photos, Tom's legal research, and David's documentation of harassment formed a comprehensive picture of corruption and abuse. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. They would coordinate simultaneous actions across multiple fronts. Federal agents would execute search warrants on HOA offices and Patricia's home, while local media would receive advance copies of the evidence, and affected residents would be contacted by federal prosecutors about joining a class action lawsuit. "The key is timing," Jake explained. "We hit them all at once before they can destroy evidence or coordinate their stories." Agent Park scheduled the operation for the following Thursday morning. She would lead a team of federal agents in executing search warrants, while local police would arrest Derek Volkoff and other co-conspirators on civil rights violation charges. The night before the operation, the team gathered one last time in David's living room. His front door had been repaired, but the memory of that morning's violation still burned in everyone's mind. "You know," David said, looking around at his brothers, "when I came home from Afghanistan, I thought the fighting was over. I thought I could just live quietly and mind my own business." "That's what we all thought," Jake replied. "But sometimes the mission follows you home." Ray closed his laptop and stretched. "At least this time we're fighting people who deserve it." Mike nodded toward the window where Patricia's house was visible in the distance. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting." Tom packed up his legal files. "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice served properly is worth waiting for." As his teammates prepared to head back to their hotels, David felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military: the satisfaction of being part of a team again, working toward a righteous goal with people he trusted completely. Tomorrow, Patricia Blackwell and her crew would learn what it felt like to have their doors broken down by people with real authority. They would discover that abusing veterans and their families wasn't just wrong, it was a federal crime, and they would find out what happened when Navy SEALs decided that enough was enough. The mission was a go. Thursday, morning started like any other day in Willowbrook Gardens. Patricia Blackwell pulled into the HOA headquarters parking lot at exactly 9 a.m., sipping her usual overpriced coffee and reviewing her agenda for another day of ruling over her suburban kingdom. She never noticed the unmarked vehicles positioned strategically around the building, or the fact that several ordinary-looking people had been watching her routine for the past week. Patricia walked through the front doors of the HOA office building with her usual confidence, nodding curtly to the receptionist and heading toward the elevator. She had meetings scheduled with city officials about expanding her enforcement powers, and paperwork to review for new violation, campaigns against residents she considered undesirable. What she found waiting in the lobby stopped her cold. 6 men in immaculate business suits stood near the reception desk, their posture and bearing immediately recognizable to anyone who'd ever served in the military. They weren't trying to look intimidating. They didn't need to. Their mere presence commanded respect and attention. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. "Ms. Blackwell, we're here on behalf of David Rodriguez and the other residents of Willowbrook Gardens, who have been subjected to illegal harassment by your organization." Patricia's face flushed red. "You have no authority here. This is private property and I'm calling security." "That won't be necessary," Jake replied, pulling out an official document. We're here to serve you with federal court papers regarding multiple civil rights violations and fraud charges." Before Patricia could respond, the front doors opened again and Special Agent Lisa Park walked in, followed by 6 FBI agents wearing tactical gear and carrying search warrants. "Patricia Blackwell," Agent Park announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from the federal government. "You're under arrest for mail fraud, wire fraud, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights." The next few minutes were chaos. Patricia tried to run toward the back exit, only to find 2 more FBI agents waiting for her. She screamed about harassment and illegal searches, apparently forgetting that she'd spent months doing exactly those things to her neighbors. Derek Volkoff arrived at the building just as Patricia was being led away in handcuffs. He took one look at the FBI vehicles and tried to drive away, but found his path blocked by federal agents who'd been waiting for him. His arrest was much more dramatic than Patricia's. Lots of shouting about his authority and threats about calling his connections in city government. Those connections weren't going to help him. At the same moment Derek was being handcuffed, FBI agents were executing search warrants at the mayor's office and 3 city council members' homes. The corruption investigation had expanded far beyond the HOA. Inside the HOA building, Ray Chen worked alongside FBI computer specialists to extract financial records and email communications. What they found was even worse than their initial investigation had revealed. Patricia and her crew hadn't just been targeting veterans. They'd been systematically discriminating against minorities, elderly residents, and anyone they considered beneath their social status. Mike Santos had positioned himself across the street with a camera, documenting everything for the federal prosecutors. The footage would eventually be used in court to show the scope of the operation that brought down the corruption ring. Tom Bradley was at the federal courthouse, filing additional civil rights lawsuits on behalf of dozens of residents who'd been illegally harassed and fined. The class action suit would eventually recover millions of dollars for families who'd been victimized by the HOA's abuse of power. David stood in his front yard, watching FBI agents carry boxes of evidence out of the HOA building. Neighbors started gathering on the street, many of them looking confused and concerned. These were people who'd lived in fear of Patricia's violations and fines for years, and they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Bill Thompson, the Vietnam veteran from across the street, walked over with his cane and stood next to David. "Is it really over?" Bill asked quietly. "The criminal part is just beginning," David replied, "but the harassment is done. They can't hurt anyone anymore." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Helen Martinez, the Marine's widow who'd been facing foreclosure over her memorial garden, called David in tears. The federal prosecutors had already contacted her about dropping all HOA-related charges and recovering the money she'd paid in illegal fines. By afternoon, the scope of the corruption was becoming clear. Patricia had embezzled over $600,000 from HOA funds. Derek and his enforcement team had conducted dozens of illegal searches based on fabricated complaints. City officials had taken bribes to grant the HOA enforcement powers they were never legally entitled to have. The local media picked up the story, and by evening news time, Willowbrook Gardens was the lead story on every channel. The footage of Patricia being led away in handcuffs, screaming about her rights while ignoring the rights she'd violated, became a viral video that was shared across social media. Jake and his team gathered at David's house that evening to watch the news coverage and plan their next steps. The criminal prosecutions would take months to work through the courts, but the immediate threat was over. "You know what the best part is?" Ray said, pointing at the television where a reporter was interviewing grateful residents. "Look at these people. They're not afraid anymore." He was right. For the first time in years, neighbors were talking openly about the abuse they'd suffered. Elderly residents were sitting on their front porches without fear of violation notices. Veterans were displaying their flags with pride instead of hiding their service. Tom had been working with federal prosecutors to ensure that the new HOA leadership would operate under court supervision. The old rules that had been used to target specific groups were thrown out, and new bylaws were written to prevent future abuse. "The legal precedent this case sets is huge," Tom explained. "HOAs across the country are going to have to think twice before targeting veterans or minorities. And the federal oversight means this community will never go back to the way it was." 6 months later, David stood in the same front yard where he'd once been cited for having grass half an inch too long. His American flag flew proudly by his front door, exactly where it had always belonged. His truck was parked in the driveway, and his house looked exactly like a home should look, lived in and loved. Patricia Blackwell was serving a 5-year federal sentence for fraud and civil rights violations. Derek Volkov got 3 years for his role in the illegal searches and harassment. The corrupt city officials were facing their own trials and had already been voted out of office. The HOA had been completely restructured under federal court supervision. The new board consisted of actual residents who focused on real community issues like road maintenance and neighborhood safety, rather than persecuting people for political reasons. Helen Martinez's Memorial Garden had become a neighborhood gathering place where residents held annual remembrance ceremonies for fallen service members. Bill Thompson was leading a committee to install proper veteran recognition displays throughout the community. The settlement money from the class action lawsuit had been used to compensate families who'd been illegally fined and to fund community improvements that actually benefited residents. The excess money was donated to veterans organizations and legal aid groups fighting HOA abuse in other communities. Jake Morrison sent David a text message on the anniversary of the raid. "Mission accomplished, brother. Freedom preserved." David smiled as he read it, then walked out to check his mail. Instead of violation notices and harassment, his mailbox contained normal things: bills, advertisements, and a thank you card from a new neighbor who'd moved to Willowbrook Gardens specifically because they'd heard it was a community where veterans were welcomed and respected. That evening, David fired up his grill for a neighborhood barbecue. The same yard where Patricia had once cited him for unauthorized outdoor cooking equipment was now filled with neighbors and friends, sharing food and stories and enjoying the kind of community that was only possible when people were free from fear. As the sun set over Willowbrook Gardens, David reflected on what they'd accomplished. They hadn't just stopped a group of bullies, they'd restored something more important. They'd proven that in America, people still had the right to live peacefully in their own homes without persecution from petty tyrants. The mission had been simple: protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. It was the same mission David had served overseas, and it turned out to be just as important at home. Some battles are fought with weapons in distant countries. Others are fought with law books and evidence files in suburban neighborhoods. But the principle is always the same: good people standing up to bullies refusing to let fear win over freedom. In Willowbrook Gardens, freedom had won.